It was just another ordinary day at school, hallways buzzing with laughter, lockers slamming shut, the smell of cafeteria food lingering in the air. But behind the everyday routine, some students carry memories they wish they could forget. Stories that don't end when the final bell rings. Stories that leave scars, both seen and unseen. Tonight, we're diving into 4 disturbing true high school horror stories. Tales of unexplained shadows lurking in empty hallways, strangers watching from the dark, and moments where reality twists into something much more terrifying. These aren't just urban legends passed around at lunch tables. They happened, and they could happen to anyone. One student recalls the time they stayed late after school, finishing a project in an empty classroom. Everything seemed normal, until they realized the janitor had already locked up for the night. That's when the scratching noises started. First against the window, then the door. At first, they thought it was just a prank. But when they looked outside, no one was there, and the noises kept getting closer. Another story takes place at a small-town high school, where a group of students discovered an old, abandoned yearbook in the library basement. It was filled with names of students who had supposedly never existed. But when they started asking questions, they were met with silence. Until one of them started seeing their own name written inside the book, on a page that hadn't been there before. These stories will make you think twice before walking alone in the halls, staying late after class, or ignoring that feeling that something just isn't right. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't in horror movies. They're right where you least expect them, hiding in the shadows of your own high school. The first story comes from a girl named Emily, a junior who stayed late after school to work on a group project. Her friends had left one by one, promising to meet the next morning to finish. She didn't think twice about staying behind, until she noticed how eerily quiet the building had become. The usual hum of after-school activities had faded, and even the janitor had locked up for the night. She glanced at the clock, 7:45 p.m. Too late to still be here, she thought. Gathering her things, she turned off the classroom lights and stepped into the hallway. That's when she heard it, the faintest sound of scratching. At first, she thought it was coming from outside, maybe tree branches against a window. But then it moved. Closer. Slowly. Emily quickened her pace, her footsteps echoing against the tiled floors. As she reached the stairwell, she paused. The sound had stopped. Silence stretched through the hallway, thick and heavy. But just as she let out a breath, convinced she was overreacting, something tapped on the glass of the door behind her. She spun around, expecting to see a friend playing a prank. But there was no one there. Just the reflection of the dim hallway lights flickering against the glass. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for her phone, trying to turn on the flashlight. The second the beam hit the door, she saw it, something pressed against the glass, barely visible, a shape that wasn't hers. A sharp gasp escaped her lips, and she bolted, running for the nearest exit. But as she reached for a handle, she realized something chilling. The doors were locked. She wasn't alone, and whoever, or whatever, was there didn't want her to leave. Emily yanked at the door handle, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. It wouldn't budge. Her mind raced. Had the janitor locked up completely? Was she really alone in the building? But she knew the answer to that last question. She wasn't alone. She turned back toward the hallway, her phone flashlight shaking in her grip. The scratching had started again, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deeper in the school. It wasn't just a random noise anymore. It was intentional, like someone or something wanted her to follow. Her first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but when she pulled out her phone, the screen flickered. The battery had been at 40% when she checked earlier, but now it was at 1%. The moment she tried to dial, it shut off completely. A dead phone, a locked building, and a sound that was getting closer. She forced herself to move, slipping into the nearest classroom and shutting the door behind her. Maybe if she stayed quiet, whoever was out there would leave. She pressed her back against the wall, listening. Then the footsteps started. Slow, heavy, Not just one pair, two, maybe more. They weren't rushed or frantic. They were steady, purposeful, like they knew exactly where she was. Emily's breath caught as she crouched behind the teacher's desk, her pulse hammering in her ears. Through the thin window of the door, she saw movement, a shadow gliding past. Then it stopped. As he reached for the controls, his mind raced through possible scenarios. He needed to buy time, figure out exactly who these men were and what they wanted. Were they after money, trying to smuggle something across the border, or was this something bigger? He needed answers, but first he had to make them believe he was cooperating. He flipped a few switches, letting the plane hum to life beneath his fingers. The vibrations of the engine sent a familiar pulse through his body, a feeling he had missed since leaving the military. He adjusted the fuel levels, his eyes flicking to the reflection in the glass. The gang members were still outside, exchanging quick words, their body language tense but controlled. They weren't nervous, not yet. That meant they thought they were in control. "Where are we going?" he asked, keeping his tone even. The leader smirked. "You don't need to know that. Just get us off the ground." The pilot nodded again, but in his mind, he was already working through their options. If they were trying to flee somewhere far, they'd need a flight path. Did they have coordinates? A plan? Or were they improvising? He could use that to his advantage. One of the younger hijackers, a guy who looked barely out of his teens, leaned closer. "How long until we take off?" "Few minutes," the pilot replied. "I need to run through pre-flight checks." The leader scoffed. "We don't have time for that." "You want to make it in the air without the engines stalling mid-flight," the pilot countered. "Then I suggest you let me do my job." The leader glared at him for a long moment, then gave a reluctant nod. "Fine, but make it quick." The pilot turned back to the controls, carefully adjusting a few settings. In reality, he was doing more than just pre-flight checks. He was searching for anything he could use to his advantage. Every aircraft had emergency protocols, fail-safe systems that could turn the tide in a crisis. If he could subtly disable certain functions, he might be able to prevent them from getting too far. He glanced at the fuel gauge, an idea forming in his mind. If he could limit their range, they wouldn't have enough fuel to reach wherever they were trying to go. But he had to be smart about it. If they caught on, they wouldn't hesitate to use force. "How do you know how to fly a plane like this?" the younger hijacker asked, curiosity creeping into his voice. The pilot smiled faintly. "It's not my first time in the air." "You a commercial pilot?" "Something like that," he said vaguely. He wasn't about to tell them about his time in the Air Force, about the missions he had flown, or the enemies he had outmaneuvered. That information was his advantage, and he wasn't going to give it away just yet. The leader rolled his shoulders, glancing at his men. "Enough talking, get us moving." The pilot exhaled slowly and placed his hands firmly on the controls. He could feel the weight of their guns pointed at his back, the unspoken threat in the air. They thought they had him trapped, thought they had everything under control. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't the first time he had faced men with weapons and bad intentions. This wasn't the first time he had been backed into a corner. And it certainly wouldn't be the first time he found a way out. The engines rolled to life, sending a low vibration through the aircraft as the propellers spun faster. The pilot kept his hands steady on the controls, his face calm despite the chaos brewing inside his head. Every second that passed, he learned more about the men holding him hostage. Their movements, their voices, their level of confidence, he was picking up on all of it. The leader, the one calling the shots, stood closest to the cockpit. He carried himself with authority, but there was something off about him. He wasn't as disciplined as a trained soldier, but he had enough experience to be dangerous. The others followed his orders, but they weren't professionals. That meant they had weaknesses, ones he could exploit if he played his cards right. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, the younger hijacker leaned over the pilot's shoulder again, watching closely. "How fast can this thing go?" he asked, excitement creeping into his voice. The pilot glanced at him briefly. fast enough. The leader shot the younger man a glare. Stay focused. We're not here to chat. The pilot suppressed a smirk. The younger one was clearly less disciplined, more eager, maybe even reckless. That could be useful. If things got out of control, he'd be the easiest to manipulate. The plane gained speed, rolling smoothly down the dirt runway. The pilot kept his grip light on the controls, pretending to focus only on the takeoff. But in his mind, he was calculating. He needed to figure out where they were headed and why. If he had that information, he could work out a way to stop them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it, something standing just behind her, close enough that the air felt different. The knock on the window had pulled her attention for only a second, but that was all it took. Slowly, she turned her head, her body rigid with fear. The room was still dark, the faint glow from the hallway casting just enough light to create shifting shadows. But there was no one there. At least, no one she could see. The knock on the window came again, more urgent this time. A boy, someone from her school, was outside, his face barely visible through the glass. His expression was panicked. He was motioning for her to move, to get out, now. Emily forced herself to her feet, her legs shaky as she bolted toward the door. Her fingers wrapped around the handle, yanking it open with a sharp pull. But the second she stepped into the hallway, she stopped cold. The air was different here, colder, heavier, like stepping into a space that didn't belong to the rest of the school. And then she saw them. Figures, not just one, but several, standing in the hallway, facing her, silent, still. Their features were blurred in the dim light, but she could tell they weren't students. They weren't teachers. They weren't human. Emily stumbled back, her chest tightening as the figures started to move, not toward her, but around her, closing off every possible way out. The boy outside was shouting now, pounding on the window. She couldn't hear his words, but she knew what he was saying. Run. But the hallway was gone. The school was shifting around her. And Emily realized, with a sinking horror, that she wasn't in the same building anymore. The voice was low, almost playful, but it sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't a voice she recognized, and it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was inside the room. Her pulse pounded as she pressed herself further into the darkness beneath the teacher's desk. The air felt different now, heavier. Then slow, dragging footsteps against the tile, not from the hallway, from just a few feet away. Emily clenched her eyes shut, willing herself to wake up. This had to be a nightmare. It had to be. But the sound kept getting closer. She could hear breathing now, ragged and uneven. Then, something brushed against the desk. Her stomach lurched. She bit her lip to stop herself from making a sound. The faint glow of emergency exit lights cast just enough of a reflection on the polished floor for her to see a pair of feet. They stood inches from where she hid, unmoving. Tears stung her eyes as she tried to think. She could make a run for the door, but what if it locked again? What if? A sudden knock on the window shattered the silence. Loud, urgent, a voice yelling from outside, "Hey, are you okay?" Emily gasped, her head snapping toward the window. And in that split second of distraction, she heard the worst thing yet. Whoever had been standing there had moved, and they were now right behind her. Emily's vision blurred as panic took hold. The hallway twisted, stretching longer than it should have, the walls seeming to pulse like something alive. The figures around her moved in slow, unnatural motions, their feet never quite touching the ground. She wanted to scream, to run, but the air felt thick, pressing against her like an unseen force. The boy outside was still pounding on the window, his face twisted in desperation. Then suddenly, his eyes widened in horror, not at her, but at something behind her. Emily didn't want to turn. Every instinct told her not to look, but she felt it, the presence looming right over her shoulder, closer than before. A slow breath, not hers, brushed against her ear. Heart hammering, she spun around, and for the first time she saw it. A face, or what was left of one. Hollow, empty eyes locked onto hers, its mouth curling into something that almost resembled a smile. The lights above flickered violently, and in that split second of darkness, Emily felt something grab her wrist, cold, unrelenting. Then, a sudden force yanked her backward. She hit the ground hard, gasping as the world around her flickered like a glitching screen. The figures, the distorted hallway, all of it, gone. She was back in the normal school hallway. Silent, empty, the lights steady and bright. Emily scrambled to her feet, her breath shaky. The window where the boy had been was empty. No sign of him, no shattered glass, just stillness. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket. Trembling, she pulled it out. A single notification flashed across the screen, a message from an unknown number. ****, you shouldn't have turned around. ***.